The Lost Zone is a mechanic dating all the way back to the Platinum expansion. It was released in October 2008 in Japan and February 2009 in the United States. It released with new cards such as Giratina Level X, Dialga Level X, and other cards with a new mechanic. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We first need to understand the Lost Zone and find out why it was such a significant feature of the gameplay. The Lost Zone is similar to the discard pile, in the sense that any card can end up there. However, the Lost Zone was different in one core aspect. You couldn't get the cards back. Once a card was sent to the Lost Zone, you could no longer use that card for the rest of the game. With the discard pile, you can use cards like Super Rod, Ordinary Rod, Rescue Stretcher, Silene, etc. to get back your discarded cards back into your deck or your hand, but with the Lost Zone, there's no coming back. I know I keep repeating myself here, but I can't stress enough how important this is as a game mechanic. The Lost Zone would have a major impact, a lost impact, you might say, on the game and its history. As I mentioned before, the Lost Zone was first introduced in the Platinum expansion in 2008 or 2009, depending on where you lived. The introduction of the Lost Zone in this set would continue in every set following until the Heart Gold Soul Silver quote-unquote expansion Call of Legends back in February of 2011 for the United States. Japan already had this set previously in the Lost Link expansion. During this time period of about 2 years, if you are talking about English release dates, there are a massive number of Lost Zone cards, ranging from normal Pokemon to level X Pokemon to stadium cards. In fact, one stadium card, Lost World, was so hyped, people thought it was going to break the game. We'll come back to that later though. This is what I would like to call the first Lost Zone era. The Lost Zone wouldn't show up again until February 2018, a whopping 7 years later. This would come in the form of Prism Star cards in the Ultra Prism expansion, and eventually would return as a main mechanic to the game in November of the same year. November's expansion was one of the biggest and most important in the history of the Lost Zone and the Pokemon trading card game competitively. This set was Lost Thunder, and it introduced multiple new cards with the Lost Zone mechanic. This was a turning point for the Pokemon TCG, the potential return of a format revolving around the Lost Zone. However, this was not meant to last. The next expansion, Team Up, focused on tag team cards, and the Lost Zone was left behind with the exception of Prism Stars. This ended the second Lost Zone era. Fast forward another 4 years, to 2022. The Pokémon Company International released the Lost Origin expansion at the beginning of September. This is where we are currently at, with cards like Comfey, Cramorant, and Giratina V-Star all dominating the format. Speaking of formats, let's talk about how the Lost Zone changed the competitive scene of the Pokemon trading card game. The Lost Zone has always had significance in every format that it's been legal in. Even all the way back in 2009, the Lost Zone showed some real strength with cards like Giratina and Dialga Level X. Giratina was a major disruption deck, Lost Zoning energy and shutting off Pokebodies, while Giratina Level X forced opponents to discard cards for attacking it. The Lost Zone definitely started as a new way to disrupt the game, structure of decks, and playstyles that previous formats previously had. That all changed when we got to the final set of the first Lost Zone era, Call of Legends. Remember that one stadium I mentioned earlier, Lost World? Well, that card was feared prior to release because people thought it was going to break the game, since it literally has the text "Win the game" in it. People thought that combining it with Gengar Prime, people thought the game was going to become unplayable. But, like many hype decks throughout the Pokemon trading card game's history, it would flop upon release. The problem ended up being that the fact that Gengar and Lost World relied on the opponent putting Pokemon in the Lost Zone, either with how many Pokemon were in the opponent's hand for Gengar's first attack, or just not getting knocked out at all, with Gengar's weak second attack, which only placed 4 damage counters on the opponent's Pokemon. This meant that Gengar was almost completely irrelevant and risky to play. The Lost Zone would disappear from play once Black and White began towards the end of 2011. When Prism Stars were reintroduced in the Sun and Moon Ultra Prism expansion 2 generations later, they immediately had a huge impact on the competitive scene. Since you could only play one of them with the same name in your deck, they became a very powerful addition to many pre-existing decks or inspired brand new ones. Prism Stars will remain in every set until after Team Up, meaning that there are a lot of opportunities to use them in a wide variety of decks. When Lost Thunder released, it was the biggest set in Pokémon trading card game history at the time. The reintroduction of the Lost Zone as a universal mechanic was incredibly hyped for many players looking for a change in the meta. However, the Lost Zone cards released, although powerful, weren't exactly able to keep up with the other powerful decks. Lost March was the main deck focusing on the Lost Zone, and it was alright, but it wasn't what people were looking for, since it was way too fragile. Teemo's release afterwards completely overshadowed the Lost Zone as a whole with the tag team cards, as we mentioned earlier, therefore ending the Universal Lost Zone's second era. Keep in mind that Prism Stars still played a huge role in the competitive scene until they rotated. And that brings us back to Lost Origin, the most current set at the time of recording this video. The Lost Zone came back in full force, but was in a completely different fashion. This time, the core idea behind the Lost Zone and related cards was to get as many cards in your Lost Zone as possible. I could sit here and re-explain the important cards in decks right now, but I'm going to recommend that you check out these things for yourself. If you want to learn about the Lost Zone's current metagame and significance, I'd recommend checking out some other awesome PokeTubers and definitely supporting them. This brings us to the end of the story of the Lost Zone and this video. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching and for your support so far. If you liked this video, please make sure to let me know. And if you're interested in seeing more topics like this on the channel, consider subscribing. It means a lot to me and it only takes a second. That's going to do it for this video, and as always, God bless and have fun. Thanks so much for watching.